Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Flourish FM, a podcast for the good life. Our guest today is Dr. Christopher Ryan. Chris is a thought-provoking author, researcher, and host of the podcast Tangentially Speaking. He gained international recognition with his New York Times bestseller Sex at Dawn, which he co-authored with Cacilda Jethá. The book reexamines human sexuality through the lens of anthropology and evolutionary biology, challenging conventional views on monogamy and societal norms. His latest book, Civilized, The Price of Progress, critiques modern society, arguing that progress has often detracted from our well-being, and that book is the focus of our conversation today. Chris's work has been translated into over 20 languages and appeared on Netflix, HBO, MSNBC, Fox News, CNN, NPR, The New York Times, The Times of London, The Washington Post, Times, Newsweek, National Geographic, and The Atlantic. He's been a featured speaker in many places, including TED and South by Southwest. With a Ph.D. in psychology, Chris combines his expertise with wide-ranging experiences from his global travels, where he has lived among diverse cultures and explored alternative lifestyles. And you can learn more about that in the show notes. Chris's work explores human nature, questioning the narrative of civilization as inherently beneficial, invites readers to rethink how we live and relate to one another, and engages audience with a critical yet hopeful perspective on human potential and flourishing. And the focus of our conversation today is how progress and civilization promote human flourishing in some respects, but also, Chris argues, hinder human flourishing in important respects which we tend not to notice. In his book, Civilized, The Price of Progress, he puts forward a compelling argument that the progress made in modern society isn't actually inherently good, and it in fact compromises happiness and well-being. He even argues that progress in today's world is analogous to an advancing disease, and we invite him to put forward that argument for us, to clarify it for us, describe it, and then we dig into specific areas of that argument. We also ask Chris about what strategies he recommends in today's world in order to make proper progress, real progress that improves human flourishing overall, rather than hinder human flourishing in various respects. It's a fascinating conversation. We hope you love it as much as we did. This is our modern civilization helping or hindering flourishing? Insights and answers with Dr. Christopher Ryan. Chris, how you doing? Welcome.
I'm doing great. Thanks. Good to be here.
Thanks so much for joining us today, man. So we've loved reading your books, and your most recent book, Civilized, The Price of Progress. You put forward a compelling argument that the progress made in modern society isn't inherently good, and that it, in fact, compromises our happiness and well-being. You even argue that progress, in inverted commas, progress defined today's world is analogous to an advancing disease. So, first question today, how is the way we're making progress today detrimental to our well-being?
Well, I think there are many ways in which what is generally called progress is, in fact, detrimental to our well-being, both physically, psychologically, mentally, socially, in so many different ways. You know, let's start with the concrete. Our bodies are nowhere near as healthy as they were 20,000 years ago. We're lethargic, we're obese, we're suffering from systemic diseases like heart disease, diabetes, high blood pressure, diseases that hunter-gatherers never faced. That we can go into that in great detail, that, you know, the sedentary lifestyle contributes to that. Highly processed foods contribute to that. And then we have issues like microplastics and contaminated water supply and, you know, so on and so forth. When you look at the psychological level, more people live alone today than have ever lived alone in the history of our species. Mm-hmm. We're a highly social species. In fact, one of the worst, short of torture, one of the worst punishments that we can mete out to the worst criminals is complete social isolation, right? So there are people in prison who would prefer to be hanging out with the rapists and the murderers and the gangbangers than to be alone in their cell in solitary confinement. That tells you how much we need contact, social contact. And yet, more people live alone right now than have ever lived alone, both proportionally and in absolute numbers. So clearly, community is fractured. Then you look at questions of meaning, whether you find meaning in religion or in belonging to a group that has some sort of meaningful cohesion or common philosophy. Fewer people than ever can say that they belong to such a group. Depression, suicide, self-harm, all of these are going through the roof, particularly with young people right now, right? And there's a lot of discussion as to whether social media is responsible for that 100% or 80% or to what extent. But what's very clear is that with the advent of the smartphone, rates of depression, self-harm, social isolation all increase dramatically among young people in particular. Yeah. So those are just a few of the ways. I mean, we could talk about that for the full hour, but I think the evidence that we're going in the wrong direction is overwhelming. And yet there is also a huge amount of effort being put into convincing us otherwise. Every society wants to perpetuate itself, so it puts a lot of investment into convincing members of that society that they're actually happy, even if their own experience tells them otherwise.
So just to dig into how it's analogous to a disease then, is it like a disease in that it's getting worse, it's spreading with some of the factors you mentioned, like technological advances and so on?
Right. And also it's like a disease in that it's systemic. It's not a trauma. It's not an acute trauma that we would recover from and go back to a healthy state. What we see is that the incentive structures for corporations are set up such that human well-being is not anywhere near the top of the priority list, if it's even on the priority list. Mm-hmm. Profit, efficiency, scale, these things are what corporations are interested in. And the fact that we've given corporations personhood, at least in the United States, legal rights that supersede the rights of individuals. A corporation is in a situation where it can contaminate the aquifer, it can contaminate the air, it can emit microplastics into the environment. And then later, we are supposed to pay for the cleanup if there is a cleanup, or we pay for the medical treatments if there even is a treatment for these things. We've set up a situation that is systemically corrosive to human well-being, I believe.
And just to summarize, I think you did it beautifully, but to make sure we're on the same page, when we talk about well-being, it sounds like you've got three great categories, which is really like physical, kind of psychological, and social, right? These things that sort of make up a generally healthy existence, right?
Yeah. And of course, the psychological, they're all intertwined, right? You can't have psychological health if you're in constant pain. But yeah, that's pretty much how I look at it. Psychological, emotional, which incorporates community, I think is a major part of that. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you feel like there's been any sort of, let's call it net benefit from some of the whatever we're thinking of as progress here? I remember hearing you on a previous podcast talking about something along the lines of, in some cases, some of the things that we perceive as progress are actually just consequences, like trying to fix things that the original progress created, right? So maybe they're just trying to tidy up the mess we created. But are there any sort of net benefits?
Well, there are definite benefits. Whether they're net or not is another question. If I would much rather if you fall from a tree and break your leg, being able to go to an emergency room and have acute care treatment is a huge benefit.
Sure.
And that's something that, hunter-gatherers obviously didn't have access to. So there's definite benefits in that respect. What you were referring to earlier is a lot of people will look at the arguments that I make and they say things like, come on, now we have vaccines against these infectious diseases, right? And you have to point out those infectious diseases were not an issue in hunter-gatherer societies, because the vast majority of those diseases originated in domesticated animals, in sheep and goats and cows and chickens and ducks and so on, the viruses or bacteria that jumped over to humans when we were living in close proximity to those animals. So having a vaccine against influenza or against tuberculosis or whatever is kind of like saying, okay, I lit your house on fire, but I brought a bucket of water. It's like it's not a net benefit for sure.
Sure. Yeah. Gotcha.
But yeah, I mean, I think one of the, somewhat selfishly, I think one of the benefits that I look at often, because I also have a podcast, is what we're doing right now. Right? This is amazing. I think podcasting is sort of on a par with the invention of the printing press in the 1400s or 1300s or whenever that was. In that we can, we've never met each other and we can speak about whatever we want. We can share whatever ideas we want. There's no corporation controlling what we say or how many people listen to this. So obviously there are downsides to this as well. A lot of disinformation is going out into the world. A lot of confusion is being generated. But if you believe on a sort of foundational level that the free exchange of ideas is likely to result in increased human flourishing, as I do, then I think podcasting and self-publishing and the sort of Substack, where I have an account, is something very interesting, and we're at the very beginning of seeing where that takes us.
Yeah.
Well, we love that idea for sure. And yeah, listeners, Chris's Substack's linked as well in our show notes. So Chris, you just want to clarify as well how kind of what period of time we're thinking of progress, because you mentioned hunter-gatherers a few times. Is your argument that humanity's been on a decline since we were hunter-gatherers, or have there been periods of progress and then a decline? So, was ancient Greece or ancient Rome or the Renaissance a period of progress, broadly speaking, on your argument? Or has it been this steady decline ever since then? Is there a particular time where it's got especially bad, say in the age of technology we're in now?
Well, it depends what matrices we're looking at specifically, right? If we're looking at physical health, for example, that would be a different kind of timeline than if we're looking at community or political progress, equality and so on. People will often point to ancient Greece or Rome as a time of political progress, and they're ignoring the fact that 90% of the people who lived in Rome were slaves, right? We're just looking at the ones who wrote books or the ones who appear in those histories of ancient Rome. So this is always a question when we talk about, is the world better today than it was at some specific point in the past? Well, better for whom, right? Are we talking about people like us who've gone to Harvard and Oxford and have PhDs and, are making a living doing, talking about ideas? Or are we talking about the average human being alive today, right? Which certainly isn't in our position. So yeah, it gets complicated because when are we talking about, what are we talking about, and who are we talking about, right? Those are all relevant to any discussion. But I would say, yes, things have gone up and down. I wouldn't want to live in medieval Europe, for example. The Black Death was a pretty significant bump in the road of human flourishing. And I think the advent of democracy on a political level is a pretty significant step forward. But again, many of these steps forward are actually steps backward from my perspective. Democracy and the idea that everyone has equal rights, that people can't be coerced into believing something that they don't believe or saying something that they don't feel is true. These values are ubiquitous in hunter-gatherer societies. So even from a political perspective, it's as if there's a swing away from these freedoms and then incremental steps back toward them. Female autonomy, the respect for women, respect for children. These are again, ubiquitous in hunter-gatherer society. So many of the, the way I tend to look at political discussions, which are, top of mind at the moment, obviously,
Sure, of course.
is, sort of left wing replicates a lot of hunter-gatherer values, and right wing replicates a lot of agricultural, civilizational values, hierarchical political systems, exploitation of labor, private property, individual hoarding as opposed to a sharing-based economy. So I feel like we're caught between these two polarities of human existence, right? The hunter-gatherer sharing, respect for others' rights, a sort of egalitarian ethos versus the post-agricultural hoarding, private property. I got mine. I'm not worried about you. You take care of yourself, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you. So you have this awesome resource on your website, which we've shared in the show notes, the Civilized to Death Cocktail Party Cheat Sheet, where you go through common objections to your arguments. And we want to describe one of these because it sounds like Chris Ryan's account of human flourishing. So in one of the objections, in discussion of one of the objections, you write, a more illuminating way to assess overall quality of life of human beings is to begin by asking what is valued by all societies, and then think about how rich or poor a society is in those areas. Free time, personal autonomy, plenty of sleep, low stress, good health, laughter, lots of friends, a rich sexual life, and a relatively quick and painless death are all valued in every society. So they suggest valid criteria for assessing quality of life. Is this your account of human flourishing and / your assessing real progress?
Yeah, I think that those are at least a good place to start. There may be some things that people want to add or subtract from that list, but I think that's a pretty solid beginning. In Civilized to Death, I told a story about a BBC journalist named Johnny Hughes, who had been in Papua New Guinea filming with a so-called Stone Age tribe, a group that lived far from civilization, and he lived with them a couple of months, I believe. And he did this documentary about this tribe. I think they were called the Mosquito tribe, if I remember correctly. Anyway, he at one point, one of the men in the tribe said to him, well, you've been here and you've seen how we live. When can we go to your world and see how you live? And Hughes thought, what a great idea, right? That would be awesome if I could get a couple of these people to come to England and, see how we live there. And the first thing he did was he contacted some anthropologists because he was afraid, after he got the BBC to approve the idea, like, okay, we'll fly these guys in and, film them. So he talked to some anthropologists because he was afraid once they see how great life is in London and, the West, they won't want to leave. And the anthropologists were like, no, man, don't worry about that. That's not going to happen. And so he was reassured by that. He flew a few of these guys in, and it's fascinating some of the conversations they had. They were staying at a house of one of the producers, and they were having breakfast one morning. And the producer's like, okay, got to go to work. I'll see you guys later. And he's leaving. Obviously, they're translators. And one of the guys from Papua New Guinea said, where you go every day? You're gone every day. And he said, well, I have to work. He said, work? What do you mean? He's like, well, I have to go and do work so I have enough money to pay for things like this house. And he said, oh, okay, how many days do you have to work to pay for the house? And the guy said, well, 30 years. And he's like, 30 years? If I need a house, my friends and I built a house in a few days. Like, why would you spend 30 years to build a house? This is crazy. Anyway, so there are all these interesting anecdotes like that. And in the end, when they were going back to Papua New Guinea, the only thing they took back with them, the only thing that to them was really valuable, it wasn't radios or lighters or whatever. It was the idea of putting feathers on arrows so that they would fly straight. I guess at some point they went to an archery range and they were really impressed by the feathers on the arrows. But the rest of it you can keep. And so there are many accounts like this in Civilized to Death of hunter-gatherer people who are introduced to life in the West and they just don't want anything to do with it.
And vice versa?
No, vice versa doesn't work, because vice versa people, I talked about all these accounts in colonial America, for example, of, colonialists who got kidnapped by the Indians and, lived with the Indians for a few years and then were rescued by the colonialists. And the first chance they got, they ran back with the Indians. There was even a law passed to prohibit colonialists from going off into the woods to live with the Indians. There's so many of them were just saying, the hell with this and going and living with the Indians. So and why, right? I think because the life of the non-civilized people, in air quotes, replicates these values that we're talking about. The plenty of sleep, low stress, good health, lots of social contact, relatively uninhibited sexuality, nutritional food, like all these things that are intrinsically, promote flourishing on all these different levels we're talking about, are much more central to most hunter-gatherer societies than they are to most Western societies.
I think that's where we're inclined to try to go next. And you mentioned, smartphones earlier, and been thinking a lot about kind of some of the work being pushed by the John Haidts of the world right now, and some of these arguments. And whatever way you feel about those arguments, I think one of the interesting things he's tried to do is like reduce some of what he's talking about down to like 4 practices or 4 rules, and I really simplify it for people in ways that you reference. And so I want to use that to kind of frame this question. You're thinking about these ingredients that John asked about. You're giving these beautiful examples of where, hunter-gatherers, don't really take to quote unquote civilized kind of culture, right? But the reverse. Often you'll see civilized folks, right, find hunter-gatherer culture very appealing. So like as you learn these lessons, what's, I don't know, 2, 3, 4 sort of, is it like practices or sort of like structures within hunter-gatherer tribes, or just kind of ways of being that you would take and say, you got to build society or a community with these in mind? You know what I mean? That like where the juice is really worth the squeeze.
Yeah, that's a good question. Before we turned on the mics, we were talking about where I live, which is this tiny little town in Colorado. And the reason I live here is because this is a place where a lot of these hunter-gatherer values can be replicated, right? It's a very small town. There are a couple thousand people at most living in this area. We get our meat from a ranch that's 20 miles away that's been there for 150 years, the same herd of cattle, just, since the 1800s. We know the rancher. We know how the animals are treated. Our water comes from an aquifer right under us. Most of the electricity we use comes from the sun. There's a huge, big solar plant right out in the valley. When a couple of days ago, my buddy was pouring some concrete, he called us up. A bunch of us went over and helped him pour the concrete. When I've got work to do here, I can call him up and he'll come over and give me a hand. He's got a trailer, so I don't need to buy a trailer. I can borrow his trailer and he can borrow my chainsaw. There's this kind of interdependence that is, I think it's emblematic of a lot of what we're talking about, because the overall structure of society benefits by every one of us buying our own chainsaw and our own trailer and doing things on our own and hiring companies. In the US, there's this State Farm, like a good neighbor is their slogan. I'd rather have a good neighbor, right? Like they're outsourcing the neighbor. Everything gets monetized and turned into a business opportunity. And so I think, if I'm looking for one principle, it would be interdependence, community, because I think that's what gives life meaning. I mentioned to you guys that we have the only place in North America with a permit to do open air cremations. If you live here and you register, when you die, your friends take your body out to the pyre and burn the body in the morning. And it's one of the most moving things I've ever seen, I've ever experienced. It's incredibly honest and incredibly pure and clean in some way, to experience this kind of recognition of the end of a life among a person's friends and family. And there's no mortuary involved. There's none of the industrial death, the death industrial complex is involved. So I just think that when and where possible, what we want to do is find that social integration, because as I said earlier, we are arguably the most social species on the planet. And yet the trajectory of modern life is toward ever greater fracturalization and isolation. And so that's what we really need to fight against.
Hi friends, Nick here with just a brief interlude to share with you an update on one of our newest partnerships with the Anti-Fragile Academy. Throughout John and I's conversations with many, if not most, of our guests, one thing has been made really clear. In order for people to flourish, thrive, experience the good life, they need to develop the capacity to not only navigate and endure, but ideally grow from the bad, grow from unpleasant experiences. That's why we're thrilled to be partnering with our newest sponsor, the Anti-Fragile Academy, an organization that I co-founded with Dr. Adam Wright, Director of Mental Performance for the Washington Nationals. At the Anti-Fragile Academy, we work with adolescent athletes, executives, and educators to help them understand some of the science, not just of optimal performance, but of well-being and anti-fragility. The ability not only to endure and bounce back from unpleasantness, but to actually come back stronger, to grow from it. Between Adam and I, we've worked with Fortune 100 companies, Inc. 300 executives, Division I programs, and elite professional athletes and Olympians from all over the world. To find out more about how you can leverage anti-fragility training, check out our website at theantifragileacademy.com.
Thank you. So let's hone in on that a little more then, about what steps you'd argue we can take to improve that in today's world of apparent progress, or perhaps not progress. So you've mentioned the problem of people living alone increasingly, and the problems of social media. It's also worth drawing attention to something you write about what hunter-gatherers did with their time compared to what we do today. What they did with their work time, which was rarely more than 3 to 4 hours a day, was what we now tend to do on vacation, playing with kids, eating together, going fishing, and so on, like the things that we kind of aspire to do when we have, quality leisure time and so on. That's what we now do outside of work time. So what are some key changes you'd love to see made, or key steps that people can take to improve social connection in today's world?
Well, I think this, because as we keep coming back to this point that what's good for human beings is not necessarily what's good for the economy. We need to understand that a lot of what we're talking about today is very subversive, right? And I think we need, at least I need to never shy away from that. There is something almost shameful about suggesting that it's better to borrow your friend's chainsaw than to buy your own, at least in American society. There's this very sort of individualistic, take care of yourself, get your shotgun and, you're going to ride out the end of the world kind of thing That's never going to work. The only way human beings ever survive anything is together. My good friend Cacilda, with whom I wrote the first book, Sex at Dawn, she grew up in Africa, and she years ago told me an expression that she heard as a little girl, which is the best place to store extra food is in your friend's stomach. And I always think of that line. It's such a beautiful sentiment, and it's not just because you want to be a good person and you want to take care of your friend. It's because that's how our species has survived. We share. And by sharing, you mitigate risk. And everyone does better.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think we need to begin by questioning the values of Western society, which pushes us in the opposite direction toward individualization, accumulation of resources, personal resources to take care of ourselves. I think we need to question that. So, for example, people in this town here, there's a piece of land. Why not build a few cabins on your land and live with your friends? Share the washing machine, share the car, share the truck, share things. Your friend is ill. Oh, I'll take care of you. Your friend has kids and I don't have kids. Great. I'll take care of your kids. Take off for the weekend. You know me. We know each other. You can trust me. You're not paying money to hire someone or a daycare center or whatever. It's not all commercialized. It's happening on a personal level. So I think that, sort of on a conceptual level, what we need to always be moving toward is taking care of each other, however that manifests, whether it's sharing a big house, sharing resources, taking care of each other when we get old, taking care of our friend's body when they die, like whatever it is, we flourish together. And the thing is, I'm aware of the fact, I'm kind of sensitive to the fact that a lot of these are cliches, right? United we stand, divided we fall, we do better together, blah, blah, blah. But the reason they're cliches is because they're true.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. And of course, we can look at certain cultures around the world, for example, countries or areas which are in blue zones where people live a long time, and see that there's often correlations there with stronger sense of community. So, for example, in Greece, where families will often live together for longer, or live on different floors of houses, will eat together more often. Seems to be less individualistic than, for example, the USA and the UK. So, examples that we're all familiar with, of course. You often find that a community is one of the strongest predictors of long-term well-being in areas like that.
Yeah, and it's interesting, almost counterintuitively, that community tends to do better in the absence of wealth.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So that's what I mean when I say these are very subversive ideas, because here in the United States, we're constantly told that we need to be chasing that mighty dollar, right? The more you get, the better you are, the happier you'll be, the healthier you'll be, blah, blah, blah. But in fact, when you look at the blue zones, as you mentioned, Costa Rica, Greece, or wherever it is, there's not a lot of wealth there. And what happens is when we have wealth, what we use that wealth for is to separate from other people. I experienced this years ago. I remember thinking about, I think it was my 21st birthday. And I'd been traveling in Mexico. And I was like, I had no money. I was, making every dollar last. And I was staying in these pensiones and, hanging a hammock up outside, whatever I could do. And it was my birthday and I was in Cancun. I was going to be flying out of Cancun. And I thought, it's my birthday. I'm going to splurge. I'm going to get a really nice room with air conditioning and CNN, and there's going to be a pool and it's going to be awesome. And I got this room and I just sat in my room and I watched TV, and then I went down to the pool and there are all these fat American businessmen, and there was nobody I wanted to talk to. It was just what am I doing? This is horrible. I spent all this money, and what did I get? All I got was isolation,
Right.
Right. And you see that wherever you see the walls go up and the tinted glass and it's just all, we use that money to counterintuitively to harm ourselves by separating ourselves from other people.
Yeah.
I'm curious how you might sort of synthesize or think through or reconcile everything you just described with the real need, as you also mentioned, for something like autonomy. And then, another term that pops into my head is the idea of meritocracy. I'm curious, like, how you feel about things like that, because these are, in certain contexts, these things can be tensions, right? I think on some level.
Yeah, well, again, we're back to subversive. I mean, I'm aware of the fact that I'm talking to a couple of, Harvard, Oxford guys here, so I don't mean to offend anybody.
No, not at all.
Don't mean to offend the high achievers among us,
not at all.
There's a story that you've probably heard about Joseph Heller, the great author, wrote Catch-22, among other books. He was at a dinner, some billionaire's house, with some other, luminaries. And the billionaire got a phone call and had to leave and go deal with his, business situation. And they're sitting at the table and somebody says to Joseph Heller, "Have you ever thought about the fact that that guy probably makes as much money in a day as you've made in your entire life from all the books you've sold?" And Heller said, "Yeah, but I've got something he'll never have." They said, "What's that?" "Enough." I think we really need to think about what is enough and the law of diminishing returns. So I lived in Spain for 20 years. And in Spain, you can get a really nice bottle of wine for 10 euros. You can get an excellent bottle of wine for 20 euros. How much better is a bottle of wine for 100 euros? I've had some and I can't taste the difference.
Yeah.
Right? So I think whether it comes to, income, there's a big difference between making $20,000, $30,000 a year and $80,000 a year. That $50,000 margin buys a lot. $200,000 to $500,000 a year, there's not much difference. 500 grand to 10 million, there's no difference. It's all labels. It's all, you wear a Rolex instead of a Casio. Who gives a shit? It's the same time. Hours go by just as fast. So I think that, the first step in all this is figuring out what is enough.
Yeah.
I remember reading what's it called? The 4-hour work week or the 6-hour work week or
4 hours by Tim Ferriss. Yeah.
Yep. So I'm reading that book and I read it years after it came out. So Tim Ferriss had already become, big time podcaster and author and all that. And in that book, he says, when you're starting out, you need to pick your number and then stick to your number. The number is, how much money do I need to be happy? So is it $1 million? Is it $500,000? Is it $10 million? What is it? How much do you need? And he says, you need to do that before you start the process of getting that money, because once you're in the process, that number keeps going up and it's like the carrot in front of the donkey. It's always just out of reach, right?
Yeah.
So you really need to think of it before you start. And I'm reading this 10 years after the book came out, and I'm thinking, Tim Ferriss didn't stick to his number. I don't know what his number was, but he's still running. He stayed. I was visiting a friend, a mutual friend. I've never met Tim, but I arrived at our friend's house, and my friend said, "Oh, Tim Ferriss was just here. He left this morning." And I said, "Oh, that's the 4-hour work week guy, huh?" And my friend said, "Yeah, he never stopped working the whole time he was here." And so, we get high on our own supply. So I think it's really important to think, what is enough? What do I need? And then be really conscious of the fact that if you keep chasing more, what are you sacrificing? You're sacrificing the days and nights of your life. You're sacrificing time you could be spending watching the sunset, looking at the stars, jumping in a cold stream, making love with your partner, listening to, having fun with your kids, telling stories. There are so many things that make life rich that we keep setting aside set it aside because no, I got to work. I got to get a little more. I got to get more. I got to get more. You're never going to get enough. So figure out what is enough. When you get there, back off. People ask me why I'm not writing more books. I had this whole conversation with an editor, the editor of Sex at Dawn, who also edited Civilized to Death. And he's like, what are you writing next? And I said, I don't know if I'm ever going to write anything else. I might be done. And he's like, what? Don't you want to be part of the national conversation? It's like, part of the national conversation? No, I want to hang out with my friends and have a private conversation. I want to enjoy what's left of my life. I don't need more fame. I don't need to be on Joe Rogan's show another 20 times. I have enough.
Yeah.
And that for a lot of people is, it's like they're embarrassed for me.
Wow. So we got two really, thank you, Chris. That was awesome. We got two really important points, I think, here just to hone in on for listeners. The first is what's sometimes called satisficing in economics, the idea of not being a maximizer and constantly aiming for more and more and more, but having a threshold that you aspire to reach and being satisfied with that, being good enough, as it were. This is good enough for me to have a great life. Satisficing rather than maximizing. The second is actually a really powerful point from the 4-hour work week, which I haven't thought about for a long time. You identify an amount you need to be really happy and try and stick to that. Even as you get more and more successful, try and stick to that original vision because of this danger of what's sometimes called the hedonic treadmill, right? You just keep wanting more and more and more, right?
Yeah, I'm sure you guys are familiar with Dacher Keltner's work at Berkeley. And a lot of those brilliant experiments that he designed seem to show that the more wealth people have, actually, the less happy they are, the more aggressive they become, the more. I made the point in Civilized to Death that it's actually psychologically very difficult to be wealthy because you have to deal with the fact that in theory, you could help people around you, but in actuality, you can't. And that's a very novel place to be for our species. We evolved for hundreds of thousands of years helping one another, sharing everything with one another. And now we're in a position where I've got resources accumulated and my good friend really needs help, but I know, well, if I help him, maybe he'll just waste it, or he won't be able to pay me back, or then other people will hear about it and they'll want money from me. Having more resources than the people around you is a very strange, evolutionarily novel place for us to be. And I think it's toxic to our well-being.
So can we just clarify that quickly? So having resources, in theory, you could help people. In actuality, you can't. That's if you try to do it by just say giving money to someone without a clear plan as to how it's followed through. Just to clarify,
right. If you speak to wealthy people, they always say it's really difficult to help. It's really difficult to know how to leverage your resources to actually benefit other people. And the story I told in Civilized to Death to sort of illustrate this was the first time I went to India, which was like 1987 or so. I'd saved up $15,000 and I flew to India and I was sitting in a restaurant. I'd never seen poverty like that. And I was sitting in a restaurant and there are all these kids standing there staring at my food. And so I ordered a bunch of samosas and I started handing them out to these kids. And immediately there were like 100 people surrounding me with their hands out. And I realized there's no way I can address this. The only way to continue this trip in India is to ignore it. And so I sort of developed scar tissue over my heart in order to exist in that environment. And I think that's what happens, on other levels when people, either through luck or hard work or family connections or whatever, end up with significantly more resources than the people around them. That's why they move to gated communities, to remove themselves from that conflict. I think whether you're on the poor side of it or the rich side of it, both sides are psychologically very difficult.
Mm. We could do like hours more. I have so many different questions and thoughts and like little nuances there I want to dig into, but there's some of these questions or some of these challenges I think are very, very complex, right? And I think you said it well earlier, sometimes the differences in what's good for, say, an economy versus a human being. What do we mean by what's good? What do we mean by well-being? All those sorts of things. A lot of different stuff to balance. And yet I'm going to ask you to try to oversimplify some things a little bit here, right? We always have this question where we're trying to get like, what's one thing? Like give people one thing that you think they can start to do. And maybe it's I think so much of what you're talking about and the brilliance of, I think, your arguments is that they can be like paradigm shifting. And maybe that's it, is like start to think about what progress and well-being and stuff means a little differently. But maybe it's a little more practical, less abstract. I'm not sure. But the simple question is, what's one thing you would tell people to consider to helpfully kind of put them on, what you might consider a healthier, more balanced path?
There's a book called A Paradise Built in Hell by Rebecca Solnit, which I highly recommend to anyone listening to this. It's a book about disaster sociology and people who've studied how humans react to disaster, whether it's war or famine or flooding or earthquakes or whatever. And, a lot of what I talk about in Civilized to Death is an argument against the neo-Hobbesian view of human nature, which is that humans by nature are solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. That's human life before the state, right? Hobbes was wrong about all of those. Life before the state was not solitary, was not poor, nasty, brutish, or short. And what Solnit shows in her book is there's an incredibly moving interview with, I don't remember his name, but he was the founder of disaster sociology. And if I'm not mistaken, he started studying human behavior in disaster for the United States military during World War II, when they were trying to anticipate how people would respond to bombing of civilian areas, like the horrific bombing of Dresden. And what he found was that rather than breaking the spirit of the Germans, when these civilian areas were bombed, people bonded together more closely. Mm-hmm. And it actually fortified the spirit of the Germans. And so the civilian bombing campaigns were counterproductive. And so this guy came back after the war and started, academic research in this, and it became a whole school of research. And he was retired when she wrote the book, and I can't remember exactly how he phrased it, but basically what he said was, after a lifetime of studying human behavior in these situations, what I found is that for people who survive it, they remember these as the best days of their lives. There was meaning. They were part of something greater than themselves. There was a sense of intimacy and community, interdependence with the people around them. The real disaster is daily life. Mm. When I read that, I thought that's the strongest argument I could possibly have here, for what I'm trying to argue in this book. The trajectory of modernity, the trajectory of Western capitalism is moving us away from the things that make life meaningful and rich and worth living. I've lost track of what your question was. You wanted me to simplify.
I love it. One thing we can do about it.
I think the thing we need to do about it is to, Joseph Campbell has this great concept, detribalization, which is something I thought about a lot when I was traveling in my 20s and 30s, is you realize you're part of a tribe when you travel. You look back and you say, oh, I'm a 20th century American white guy. I never thought about that, right? I thought everybody else was something and I was just normal. I was the center, right? So when you travel, you start to see, this sense of relativity that everybody thinks they're normal. Nobody thinks they have an accent, right? Everybody else has an accent.
Yeah.
So I think first step is detribalize, question the belief structure that you just sort of grew up with, which is no easy task. And then once you've done that, as Shakespeare said, to thine own self be true. Figure out what is truly valuable for you. It's rarely money. It's rarely economic matrices. It's something about love. It's something about richness. It's something about helping other people. Figure out those things, what's really true for you, and pursue that. It's very hard to do because you're going against a lot of the values inculcated by our culture, but
sure.
That's what I've spent my life trying to do, and that's what motivates me to do the podcast and write the books.
Yeah, great. Appreciate it. It's
awesome,
great.
Chris. That's a great, final lesson for our listeners to take away. And check out that book, A Paradise Built in Hell, by Rebecca Solnit.
It's a great title. Great.
All right, so we're about to wrap here. So where can people find out more about you and your work, Chris?
Yeah.
My Substack account is where I'm most active. That's chrisryan.substack.com. And you can find everything there. I also have a website, thatchrisryan.com.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Chris, for your time today. We really enjoyed this conversation. We hope you have too, our listeners and our watchers. This has been our conversation with Dr. Christopher Ryan.
Thanks so much for listening to Flourish FM. We hope you enjoyed the content. Please be sure to leave us a 5-star review and hit that subscribe button wherever you listen to your podcast and on all major social media platforms.
And if you visit our website, flourishfmpodcast.com, you can sign up to our newsletter. We send out a weekly newsletter. First newsletter of every month, we share a long-form blog, and every newsletter, every week, we share highlights from our previous episodes. Please hit subscribe on our website.